The morning sun spilled gold across the small town of Willow Creek, painting the one-room schoolhouse in warm light. Inside, the shy new teacher, Miss Clara Bennett, straightened the books on her desk for the third time. Her heart beat faster than it should have for a normal day, but this was her first morning teaching here, and her first time meeting her new students. The door creaked open softly, and the first child stepped in, a small girl, maybe 6, with a white ribbon in her chestnut hair and the gentlest eyes Clara had ever seen. But there was something different about her. She didn't speak. She only smiled and lifted her hand in a careful, practiced motion that Clara recognized instantly: sign language. Clara's breath caught. She signed back, "Good morning." The little girl's eyes widened in surprise before she beamed so brightly it made Clara's heart twist. The girl ran to her seat, turning to look back at her father, who stood framed in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sun-roughened face and quiet eyes the color of deep earth. His hat was in his hands, his shirt dusted from work. He didn't speak at first, only gave a polite nod. "I'm Samuel Holt," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "This is my daughter, Ellie. She doesn't talk, been deaf since birth." Clara nodded softly. "She's wonderful," she said, signing the same words so Ellie could understand. Something shifted in his expression, something like surprise, maybe even gratitude. "You know sign." "I do," Clara said, her voice quiet. "My younger sister was deaf. I learned for her." He looked at her for a long moment, his hand tightening slightly on his hat. Then he said simply, "Thank you," and left. As the weeks passed, Ellie became the light of Clara's little classroom. She was curious, gentle, and had a way of drawing others toward her. Her silence never made her invisible. The other children learned small bits of sign language from Clara, turning their words into gestures, laughter, and new ways of seeing the world. Every afternoon, Samuel came to pick Ellie up. Sometimes he stayed by the fence, leaning on it while his daughter waved goodbye. Sometimes he'd step closer, asking how Ellie was doing, his voice soft, as though afraid of breaking the calm that surrounded Clara. At first, Clara only replied with short answers. She was not used to men like him, men with a presence so sure, so solid it seemed to fill the space between words. But slowly, she began to open, little by little. One afternoon, when a summer storm rolled across the plains, Samuel arrived early. The rain came hard, soaking through his coat before he could reach the porch. Clara rushed to open the door, pulling him inside. "You're drenched," she said, her cheeks coloring as she met his eyes. He smiled faintly, water dripping from his hair. "Didn't mean to intrude. Just didn't want Ellie walking home in this." Clara shook her head, grabbing a towel from the shelf and offering it to him. "You're not intruding." Their hands brushed, just slightly, and for a second, only a second, neither moved. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something unreadable passed between them. Ellie came running, her small hands flying in signs. "Papa. You're wet." Samuel laughed, the sound warm and rare. He knelt, letting his daughter wrap her tiny arms around him. Clara watched the tenderness in that moment, the love so pure it almost hurt to see, and something inside her softened. That evening, the storm raged outside, but inside, the schoolhouse was filled with laughter and flickering lamplight. Clara made them tea. Ellie drew with chalk on the board. Samuel sat near the window, silent, watching both of them as if they were something fragile he was afraid to break. When the rain stopped, he rose. "Thank you," he said again, his voice low. "You've done more for her than you know." Clara smiled gently. "She's done the same for me." He hesitated before putting his hat back on, eyes lingering on her just a moment longer. "You ever been out to Holt Ranch?" She shook her head. "Maybe you should come," he said. Ellie would like that. She wanted to refuse, to stay safe in the quiet walls she had built around her heart, but the thought of Ellie's bright smile was enough. The following Sunday, Clara found herself driving the dusty road that wound up to the Holt Ranch. The land stretched endlessly, rolling fields of golden grass, horses grazing lazily, the sound of wind whispering across the open sky. Ellie ran to meet her, signing excitedly about the horses, the barn, the kittens that lived under the porch. Clara laughed, following her through the wide doors where Samuel was mending a saddle. He looked up, the faintest spark of surprise in his eyes. "Didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," she said truthfully. "But she can be very persuasive." He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. That she can. As the afternoon unfolded, Clara found herself laughing more than she had in months. Samuel showed her how to brush a horse properly, his large hands guiding hers over the coarse mane. Their fingers brushed, and she felt a shiver, not of fear, but of something dangerously close to longing. They shared stories, hers about the city she left behind after her sister's passing, his about the ranch, his late wife, the years he spent raising Ellie alone. When the sun began to sink, he said quietly, "You remind me of peace, Clara." She froze, unsure how to respond. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, they carried weight. "I don't think I've had that in a long time," he continued. Her eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time you did." From then on, her visits became more frequent, sometimes to help Ellie with her studies, sometimes to share supper at the ranch. Each time, Samuel seemed to find reasons to linger near her, to fix something, to ask her thoughts, to simply sit in the quiet while Ellie played nearby. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was something gentler, like the slow blooming of wildflowers after rain, small, steady, patient. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Clara found a small wooden box on her desk. Inside was a silver locket, engraved with delicate vines. Inside, a tiny drawing of Ellie, and beside it, a pressed daisy. There was no note, just his initials, S.H. She looked up through the window and saw him waiting outside, hat in hand, eyes searching hers. When she stepped out, words caught in her throat. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded, his voice rough. "Ellie thought you should have it." "I agreed." They stood in silence for a moment, the dusk deepening around them. Then he said, quietly, "I never thought I'd feel something again. Not after what I lost." Clara's heart ached at the honesty in his tone. She reached out, hesitantly, touching his arm. "Maybe love doesn't ask if we're ready. It just waits until we are." He met her gaze, something fierce and tender in his eyes. Then, slowly, as if afraid she might vanish, he leaned down and pressed his lips softly against her forehead. It was not a kiss of possession or passion, it was something deeper, something sacred. From that night on, everything changed in ways that words could never quite capture. He started visiting the schoolhouse more often, sometimes bringing fresh milk, sometimes fixing the old fence that creaked in the wind. The townsfolk whispered, of course, they always did, but Clara didn't care. There was peace in his presence, warmth in Ellie's laughter, and something new blooming in her heart. The day Ellie signed, "Papa loves you," Clara froze, her heart pounding. Samuel, standing nearby, looked both startled and caught. Then, after a long moment, he said simply, "She's right." He took Clara's trembling hands in his. "I tried to fight it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But every time I see you with her, every time I see what you bring into our lives, I know I don't want a day without you in it." Tears filled her eyes. "You're not the only one who's been lonely," she whispered. He drew her close, his forehead resting against hers, and in that quiet moment, everything else fell away, the years of loss, the silence, the fear. There was only the warmth of his arms, the soft laughter of the little girl who had unknowingly brought two hearts back to life, and the wind whispering outside, carrying the scent of spring and the promise of something beautiful beginning. The weeks that followed passed like a gentle dream Clara didn't want to wake from. Every morning she woke before dawn, brushing her hair, tying it back neatly, and walking the small dirt path that led to the schoolhouse. The air smelled of wild sage and dust, the horizon washed in soft hues of gold. And almost every morning, before the first bell, she would look up to find a tall figure standing near the fence, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Samuel Holt rarely said much, but he always greeted her the same way, with a quiet nod, his hat in his hands, his eyes carrying something steady and safe. Ellie would run ahead, her little satchel bouncing at her side, signing excitedly about the lessons she hoped to learn that day. Clara had come to treasure those small moments, the rush of air when Ellie's arms wrapped around her waist, the warmth that filled the space when Samuel's low voice rumbled softly, asking, "She been behaving?" Sometimes, Clara wondered how she'd lived so long without them. The bond between teacher and child had deepened quickly. Ellie, once shy and guarded, now shone with joy. She flourished under Clara's care, her hands always moving, signing stories, jokes, dreams. Clara taught her more than words, she taught her the rhythm of poems, the feel of raindrops, the music of wind through leaves. But what she didn't expect was how much Samuel began to change too. At first, he only lingered for a few minutes after school, helping fix a broken hinge, repairing the roof, mending old desks. Then those few minutes became hours. Sometimes, he'd stay just to talk, to ask about her day, to listen to the sound of her voice as if it steadied something inside him. Clara had never known a man like him. There was a quiet depth to Samuel, a weight in the way he carried himself, as if every word and silence came from somewhere hard-earned. He didn't speak of his late wife often, only once when Clara asked if Ellie remembered her mother. She was 5 months old when her mother passed, he said quietly, eyes turned toward the horizon. Ellie only knows her through the stories I tell her, and maybe through the way I still see her in that little girl's smile. Clara had wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the pain in his eyes had told her words would only cheapen it. So she simply stood beside him, letting the silence do what words could not. That was how their friendship, if it could still be called that, grew. Through shared silences, glances that lingered too long, and a tenderness that neither dared to name. One crisp autumn afternoon, Clara brought a basket of apple pies she'd baked for the children. Ellie squealed in delight, signing rapidly that her father loved apple pie. Samuel, who arrived just as the children were leaving, raised a brow when he saw the basket. "Smells like temptation," he said, that rare, crooked grin playing on his lips. Clara laughed, her cheeks flushing. "You can't expect children to learn on empty stomachs. And you can't expect their teacher to bake all that and not share with a hungry rancher," he teased, his tone lighter than usual. So she did. They sat on the porch steps while Ellie played with a stray kitten near the fence, and Samuel took a bite that made him close his eyes in appreciation. "Best thing I've tasted in a long time," he murmured. Clara smiled softly. That's high praise, coming from a man who looks like he could survive on black coffee and determination. He laughed, a deep, warm sound that made her chest tighten. "You're not wrong." They talked until the sky turned pink and the air grew cool, their shoulders brushing once, twice, accidentally, or maybe not. She didn't know anymore. But that night, lying in bed, Clara could still feel the warmth of his presence beside her, the steady sound of his voice echoing softly in her mind. Days became weeks, and the town began to notice. Whispered words followed her at the market, gentle but pointed. "The teacher and the rancher. He's still grieving. She's not one of us." Clara pretended not to hear, but sometimes, in the quiet hours, she wondered if they were right. She wasn't from Willow Creek. She didn't belong to this small world of shared histories and buried sorrows. She had come to escape, to start anew after losing her sister to illness. She had promised herself she would not fall again, would not let her heart depend on another soul. But Samuel Holt and his little girl had changed that without trying. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the ranch fields in firelight, Samuel invited her to stay for supper. Ellie had begged her with wide eyes, signing, "Please, Miss Clara, please stay." She couldn't say no. Inside, the house smelled of hay, wood, and warmth. A single lamp glowed on the table, where plates were set with care. The meal was simple, roast chicken, bread, and sweet potatoes, but Clara couldn't remember when food had ever tasted better. After dinner, Samuel poured coffee, and they sat on the porch again, watching the stars bloom across the darkening sky. "I never thought I'd get used to the quiet," she said softly. "But out here, it feels different. It's not empty, it's peaceful." Samuel nodded. "It's how I survive. Out there, with the cattle and the wind, you start to hear things you didn't before. Your own thoughts, mostly. Sometimes that's the hardest part." She looked at him, her heart tightening at the loneliness in his tone. "Do you still miss her?" He was silent for a long time before answering. "Every day. But it's not the same kind of missing anymore. It's more like gratitude. For what she gave me. For Ellie. For the years we had." Clara's throat felt thick. She must have been a remarkable woman. "She was," he said. Then he turned his gaze toward her, voice dropping lower. "But you are too." Her breath caught. He didn't reach for her. Didn't move closer. He only looked at her in that steady, soul-bearing way of his, and she felt her resolve unravel. She left soon after, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. But that night, when she closed her eyes, she saw him again, the quiet strength in his gaze, the way his voice trembled slightly when he spoke her name. The next morning, he was waiting by the fence again. He didn't speak at first, only watched as she guided Ellie and the other children into the classroom. When the bell rang, Clara walked out to him, folding her hands nervously. "You're here early," she said softly. He nodded. Couldn't sleep. There was something raw in his eyes, something she had seen once before, years ago, when her sister lay dying and she had stood helpless, praying for words that never came. It was the look of a man fighting against his own heart. "Clara," he said, her name sounding almost like a confession. "I told myself I wouldn't do this. That I couldn't. But I can't keep pretending you don't mean something to me. You do. You and Ellie, you're everything I didn't know I still needed." Her breath trembled. "Samuel, I know I don't have much to offer," he said, voice rough. "Just a ranch, a little girl, and a man who's been half alive since his wife passed. But when I see you with her, when I see how she lights up around you, I can't help but think maybe God sent you here for us." Her eyes filled with tears. "You think too highly of me." He shook his head. "No, I don't think highly enough." And before she could stop herself, she stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm, and in that moment the world seemed to still. It was Ellie's laughter that broke the silence, calling them back to earth. They turned to see her standing by the door, her small hands forming a heart in the air. That night, Clara cried, not from sadness, but from the sheer, aching beauty of it all. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Winter came swiftly, covering the plains in frost. The schoolhouse grew colder, the stove burning from dawn till dusk. Samuel began arriving early to light the fire for her, insisting it was too much for her to handle alone. Sometimes, he'd bring breakfast, fresh eggs, biscuits, or hot coffee. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like family. On Christmas Eve, Samuel invited her again to the ranch. There was a tree in the corner, small but full of charm, decorated with ribbons and handmade ornaments Ellie had crafted. She gave Clara a tiny paper heart with the words "Thank you for hearing me" written in shaky letters. Clara hugged her tightly, tears blurring her vision. Samuel stood nearby, watching with a tenderness that made her knees weak. Later that night, after Ellie had gone to bed, he poured her a cup of cider and led her outside. The stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch. "Do you ever think," he said quietly, "that maybe we don't get second chances, but we get the right people to help us live the first one better?" She looked up at him, her breath visible in the cold. "I think, sometimes God brings the right hearts together when they've both learned what it means to lose." He stepped closer then, his gloved hand brushing her cheek, the warmth of his touch cutting through the winter air. "I don't want to lose you too," he whispered. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She only rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, soft and trembling, a kiss that felt like surrender. It wasn't perfect, nothing between them ever was, but it was real. In the months that followed, their lives intertwined more deeply. Clara moved her things into the small house beside the ranch, still teaching at the school but returning home each evening to Ellie's laughter and Samuel's steady presence. The town that once whispered began to soften. They saw the joy in the child's face, the peace in the rancher's eyes, and the quiet strength in the woman who had brought light back into their lives. Sometimes, Samuel would come home from the fields, dusty and tired, to find Clara reading with Ellie by the fire. He'd stand in the doorway for a long time, just watching, his heart full to the brim with gratitude he didn't know how to put into words. One evening, after tucking Ellie in, Clara stepped outside. The sky was clear, the moon casting silver over the fields. Samuel joined her, his arms sliding around her shoulders. "You ever think about what your sister would say if she saw you now?" he asked softly. Clara smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. "She'd tell me I finally stopped hiding." He kissed her forehead, his voice low. "You brought life back to us, Clara. You brought me back." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by wind and stars and the soft hum of the night, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The shy teacher who once walked into town alone had found more than a hum of the night, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The shy teacher who once walked into town alone had found more than a classroom, more than a child to teach. She had found a family, a love that spoke louder than words, and a home in the silence that used to scare her. For in that silence, Samuel's heart spoke, Ellie's laughter sang, and Clara finally understood that sometimes love doesn't need sound to be heard. It only needs two souls brave enough to listen. Spring came early that year, softening the frost and bringing color back to the land. The ranch fields turned green again, dotted with wildflowers that nodded in the breeze. Clara stood on the porch one morning, watching Ellie chase butterflies near the fence, her laughter silent but brighter than any sound. Samuel came up behind her, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. In that moment, she thought of how far they had come, from strangers joined by chance to a family stitched together by grace. She had arrived in Willow Creek with nothing but a suitcase of books and a heart too shy to hope again. He had been a man who spoke little, who buried his grief beneath long days and endless work. And yet, life had a way of weaving two broken pieces into something whole. There were still hard days. Times when the wind carried ghosts of the past, when Samuel would stand quietly by his wife's grave and Clara would stay beside him, her hand finding his without a word. But there was peace now, a quiet, rooted kind of love that didn't ask to be loud. It simply was. The townsfolk had long stopped whispering. Now they waved when they passed the ranch, some even sending their children to Clara's class to learn the hand signs that Ellie used. The little girl who once lived in silence had taught an entire town a new language, not just with her hands, but with her joy. One evening, as the sun bled gold over the hills, Samuel lifted Ellie onto his shoulders, and she signed across the yard to Clara, "You're my mama now." The words hit her with such warmth that tears stung her eyes. She nodded, signing back, "And you're my heart." Samuel's eyes met hers over the child's laughing face, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw no trace of pain, only quiet, overflowing love. Later that night, as the three of them sat together by the fire, Clara reached for Samuel's hand. "You know," she whispered, "when I first came here, I thought I was running away from life. Turns out, I was walking straight into it." He smiled, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "You gave us back what we'd lost," he said. "Hope, home, maybe even faith." She shook her head softly. "No, Samuel. You and Ellie taught me how to live again." Outside, the night deepened, stars shimmering over the open land. The wind hummed through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and spring. In that small house on the edge of the ranch, three hearts beat in quiet harmony, a man who had loved and lost, a woman who had hidden from her pain, and a little girl who had shown them both that love could speak without words. And though the world beyond their fence was wide and uncertain, they no longer feared it. For they had already found everything they needed, right there, beneath the endless sky, in the silent language of love.